Now we're going to look at animating the stroke paths on an SVG. The first requirement is the stroke has to be a part of the SVG element itself. So what you're looking at here is the SVG parent and the path element, the path child of the SVG parent that has a stroke property. And this is what we're going to try to recreate here. And so I recommend just quickly reading this article and getting an understanding of what we're going to recreate. Okay, so we have our files from the previous screencasts, and if we use the image element and load in this case the responsive SVG file, notice it doesn't have a stroke attached to it. Visually it does, but if we select the element and apply the stroke property, which will give us a stroke color, and so here if we make the stroke color red, notice nothing happens. So what we want is not the file itself, but the code that makes up the SVG. Easiest way to do that is open it up in your browser and go to View, Developer, View Source, or nerd out and go Option Command U. Regardless, you want the source code. So now that you have the source code, you just want the SVG code itself. You can ignore the comments for the SVG. The code for the SVG, we can replace the IMG element with the SVG element, and instead of selecting the IMG element, we're going to select the SVG parent, and in this case, right, and again it's going to vary depending on how you make your SVGs inside of Illustrator or Sketch. We want the text element because that text element holds the word Google, and if we SVG parent text child, we see that the stroke color is indeed changing. So now we've isolated the stroke. The next thing we need to look at is the individual stroke itself. So right now it's one consistent stroke, and what we want to do is break it up into small parts. So the size of each individual dash or stroke, or all the ants in the marching ants, in this case there's no unit, but we're going to say just take the entire stroke and cut it up, and in this case make it 1, in this case make it 2, and if we increase this number, we'll begin to see that each stroke path gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So now we need to look at the stroke offset. So we're going to start with that unitless number of 1 again, and if I bring this up in the debug tools, you can begin to see how this works. So the stroke dash array is the size of each individual stroke. In this case we can make it 1, we can make it 10, and they're just going to get 10 times the size. And the stroke offset is how far it's pushed or moved from its original position. And if we inspect this and take a look at the stroke dash offset, watch what happens once we manually increment it. And if we manually increment it 1 at a time, you can begin to see how the little ants move. And if we make this stroke dash a little bit bigger, we can do that exact same thing. So if I put this number back at 1, and then if I incrementally move it, I'm moving it 1 stroke dash array at a time. So with these 3 properties, we can go ahead and automate this process. Now that we can see how we can manually make each dash stroke move, we can automate the process with a keyframe animation. Let's change the color first to make it something a little easier to see. And then we're going to simply write our keyframe animation, and we can call this whatever we like. How about dasher? And what's the thing that's being animated? And that's probably the toughest part. So first off, we're going to say animate to the last frame. So animate all the way through. And then we're going to take the stroke offset, and that is what is being animated. That's the value that was being changed. And you can give it an arbitrary number, and these numbers are going to vary again depending on the size of your SVG and the size of your animation. But let's just go ahead and make it 100. So basically take the size of each dash stroke, which is 1, and move it about 100 pixels along the stroke path. And then the next thing we need to do is actually call the animation, and we do that with the animation method. The animation property. And what's the name of our animation? Dasher. How long should it run for? In this case, 1 second. And how many times do we want it to run? That's how about 3 times. And if we put it on infinite, it will run infinitely. Right? And there we see that each individual one dash stroke is moving about 100, and you can fine-tune these numbers to anything you like. For more clarity, you can put in the first frame, a middle frame, or any number in between. So we're going to go again from the stroke dash offset of 1 to 100. In this example here, you can see that the dash array is about 1,000, and then it's going to go from 1,000 all the way to 0. So it says move to the 1,000th point and then go all the way back to 0, and that's what's being animated. So the first question is, well, where did this 1,000 come from? So let's take a look at our example here. So looking at our example here, I've turned off the animation for the time being because, again, like everything else, do it manually and then figure out how to automate it from there. So we're going to turn off the animation for temporarily, and each individual stroke right now is at 1 pixel, and watch what happens when I make it 10 pixels, okay, or 100 pixels, okay, or 100 points along the path. So I should probably stop using pixels. And so that 1,000 was just happened to be the shape, about the length of this shape drawn in Illustrator. And so what we're trying to figure out, well, is how long is our shape, and this number is going to vary. And so that's about 200, and we see that the shape is drawn all the way through, and here is 180. Is it still drawn all the way through? So for us, 180 is going to give us a path that is drawn all the way through. So now that we have that number, if we match the first frame of the stroke dash offset to the stroke dash array, in this case 180 and 180, and then so go to the 180th position and then draw all the way back to its first position, or 0. And if we turn this back on, we can see it animate through there, and it's animating really quickly because it's drawing from 180 to 0, right, in 1 second. So we can make it 5 seconds. You can see it slowly drawing through in 5 seconds. And if you want to have it draw infinitely, you probably want to use forwards here in this example, and that'll make sure that that last animation is smooth as it picks up from the last spot there. You can see it. Now you can see this without forwards, and it's not as smooth. So there you have it. Next thing we're going to take a look at is how do we automate this with JavaScript.